Hello everybody, welcome back to another video, and in this one I'm going to be giving lots of tips for how you can paint a realistic looking portrait using watercolors, and I'm going to be answering the most asked questions from you guys about this topic. For example, how to mix different skin tone colors, how to get your skin really smooth, and how to paint hair. Before we start, I just want to say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare, and I'll be talking a lot more about Skillshare a bit later into the video. Firstly, I'm getting together all of the painting supplies that I'll be using for this portrait, and I'll have all of the materials listed out in the description below so that you can check out what I'm using. I'm going to be using cold pressed paper for this painting, but you can also use hot press, it's completely up to you. I'm also going to be using my cotton watercolors, some washi tape to border off the painting, and also gouache for lots of highlights. So the first thing that I always do when I'm painting a portrait is I make sure that I pre-wet the surface of the paper. And this is such a key step if you want your painting and your skin to look really smooth and you don't want any harsh edges. And this is a key first step that a lot of people miss out. They'll just go straight in with their paints, and it can be very hard to get a smooth look that way. So I just gently wet the whole of the face and I miss out the eyes. So I'm going over the nose and mouth, but I am missing out the eyes because I don't want any of the colours to bleed into these areas. Now I'm going to start off my painting by creating an underpainting, an undertone. And I was painting 11 from Stranger Things, and it was a very nighttime sky scenery, so it was very dark and she had this purple sort of shadow on mainly the left side of her face. So I thought to get this in and to make the skin look realistic, I would start off by creating a purple underpainting. And you can see that because we've already pre-wet the paper, the colours nicely bleed into each other and you don't get any harsh lines. So I just mixed in a bit of purple with a bit of Payne's grey, which is like a bluey grey tone, and this made the perfect colour for an underpainting. Now your reference might not need an underpainting, it might not have harsh shadows or really strong colours cast and reflecting on the skin, so it's up to you whether you want to do this step. I'm mainly using this step to paint in all of the shadows on the face, which tend to be on the left side of the face mainly, on the side of the nose, around the eyes and around the chin as well. And for this step, just look at your reference and pick out the key shadows, and that is where you should be applying your underpainting. We don't have to focus too much on painting in the lightest areas for now, especially with my reference. That's where we can lay it over the skin tone later on. This is just for getting in the main structure of the face, the highlights and the shadows. And as you can see, we've got a realistic looking face structure now. We just need to make the colour look a lot more accurate. Now, if you're finding that the paper is starting to dry out and the colours aren't bleeding out anymore, then make sure you wait for it to completely dry, wait for that layer to dry, and then pre-wet the paper again and carry on building up more layers. Because if it dries too much, then the wet and wet technique just simply won't work and you'll start to get those harsh edges again. So painting skin really is a layering process. I'm now building up some details in the eyes, and I'm still creating that shadowed base layer. I'm not going to be getting in all of the different colours for the eyes. I'm just using black paint at this point to block in the darkest parts of the eyes, for example the pupils and around the iris and also the eyebrows as well. So now we've finished getting in the underpainting for the face, it's time to mix our skin tone and add it to the skin as well. Now this definitely was a question that a lot of people was asking. How do you mix different skin tones and how do you get the skin to look really smooth when you apply the paint to the face? Well, let's go through how to mix a good skin tone. So I normally use 3 different colours, a yellow ochre, a red and a brown. And depending on the skin tone, that will vary the amount of each paint that you will add. So add a tiny bit of the yellow ochre, a bit of the red and some brown. And if you need the skin to be really pale, then add more water to dilute that paint. If you need the skin to be more pink toned, you would add more red. And if you need it to be more yellow undertoned, then you'd add more yellow. And if you need it to be darker, you'd add more brown. Now this is obviously a very simplified version of how to create different skin tones. If you've got a really purple light on the skin, then you might need to add more purple, or if it's more blue undertoned, then you can mix in different colours to make it really accurate. But for now, let's go through just a basic recipe for how you can create different skin tones. So the first few swatches here have got more of a yellow undertone to them. They've got more yellow mixed in, and you can see that I've created 3 different skin tones just by adding more and more water as I go down the swatches. Now let's create a more red toned skin tone. So I added a bit more red to the paint, and I'm going to do the same thing, first creating a darker version of that skin tone. And then I'm going to slowly add more and more water into the paint to get lighter and lighter varieties of that same skin tone. So remember, if you want a skin tone to be really light, then add in more water. If you want it to be really dark, then you'll need to have a stronger concentration of the paint with less water and potentially more brown. Now I want to create a really dark skin tone, so I mixed in quite a bit more brown. And you can see that this gives a really nice, rich, dark skin tone. And once again, to create the lighter varieties, I'm just adding a bit more water. And even if the skin is really dark, you may need these lighter varieties for the highlights. You can see that in certain areas, you can also dot in some other colours like I did with the red to create varieties even within that main skin tone. So now let's mix the same paints up, and I'm going to create some larger swatches. So once again, I mixed in quite a lot of water for this because I wanted a really light skin tone, and I created pretty much very even ratios of the yellow ochre and the red. So it's a nice in-between tone, and you can see how natural that looks, and it looks like a really realistic skin tone. It's not too vibrant and it's not too dull, it just works really well. And on the right hand side now, I'm going to do a skin tone that is more pink toned, and also I'm going to add in a bit of purple for the shadow. So I'm going to be painting a pinkish skin tone that has purple for the shadows. So I'm going to mix a bit of purple and some Payne's Grey, just like I did for the 11 painting for the underpainting, and I'm just going to work that through the top where the shadow is going to be. And you will see that a lot of the time with really pink skin, you can have purple and use purple for a really nice natural looking shadow. Also with skin, it's really important that you know that you can layer and glaze different colours over the top once your initial layer has dried. That is really important and will add a lot more depth to your painting. So that was just a quick guide for how you can paint different skin tones. Now before we move on to painting the skin, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. So Skillshare is an online learning community with over 25,000 different classes in areas like design, business, technology, and lots more. So whether you want to improve your art skills even further, or learn a new skill like editing, photography, or even learning to cook new recipes, then there will be something on there for you at Skillshare. With Skillshare's premium membership, you can get unlimited access to all of the different classes on the site so that you can join the classes and communities that are just right for you. There are lots of great watercolour classes on Skillshare as well, so if you want to improve your watercolour skills even more, then there are a lot of beginner classes on there where you can learn and build confidence with different watercolour techniques. Skillshare is also really affordable. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month, but for the first 500 of you guys that sign up using the link at the top of the description, you will get a 2-month free trial so that you can check it out, see how you get on, take some of the classes, and then see if you want to carry on with the subscription. Thank you Skillshare once again for sponsoring today's video. Now that we've gone through how to mix up different skin tone colours, it's time to apply that to the face and get some really nice smooth shading. So as always, it's still really important to pre-wet the whole of the face before you go in and build up any more layers, to make sure that we do get that really smooth finish. And that really is the key to getting smooth shading on the face, is just make sure everywhere is nice and wet before you add any paint so that you don't get any harsh edges. When I'm working on painting the skin, I'm not trying to actively blend out the different colours. I just really place the colour where it needs to be and I'll move it around, but I'm not trying to blend it all out. Because the paper's nice and wet, it will bleed and blend itself out to give a really nice smooth finish. Now I added a really diluted version of the skin tone all over the face, but on the shadowed side we need to build up a stronger version of that skin tone with less water, with the same ratios and different colours, the yellow, the red and the brown, and I just use less water to really intensify the shadows and make sure that you're covering the purple on that left hand side. So you can see that the skin has obviously got a purple hue shadow to it, but it still looks like a natural skin tone, and it looks like she is in that night sky environment. I'm also building up some more layers on top of the lips, and they are very red in the reference, so I'm building up lots of pinks and red tones over the top of the purple. Now it's time to go through how to paint the hair. Now this was another question that a lot of you guys were asking me. How do you paint the hair? How do you build up details in the hair? And so I'm going to go through how I personally build up the different layers when I am painting hair. I'm just going to be painting a lock of brown curly hair. Now I start off with a very diluted wash, and because it's brown I'm using a very light brown tone, and I just use this to map in the basic shape of the hair. I'm not adding any details, I'm just blocking in the mass and the form of that curl of hair. You can see that I'm just sweeping the brush, not creating any details, I'm just blocking in that shape. And that is what I do for the first layer. I'm also getting in any wispy bits and loose bits of the curly hair that's going around that main lock as well, to make it look more realistic. Now it's very important that you then wait for that whole layer to completely dry before you work on this second layer. With the second layer I'm using slightly stronger paint, not really dark brown, because I'm going to be doing another layer in a minute which is going to be even darker, but more of a mid-tone brown. And I'm going to be using this to build up the details. Now it's very easy to build up the details in this way because the initial layer is already dry, so nothing is going to bleed out. I work on the shadows and I'm going in lines that are going towards the highlights, and you can see that I'm not adding any other layers where the highlights are. My base tone that I add in the first layer is normally the colour that the brightest highlights are. So I'm also working in the direction the hair is going in, and I'm using a nice small brush. The smaller the brush you use, the easier it is to build up these details. And I'm just working on it section at a time. Whenever you want to build up a new layer of details, where you'll be going over a layer that you've already done, it's important to make sure that that layer is completely dry before you then start to build up another layer. So that's what I'm doing now. I've waited for that second layer to completely dry, and I'm going in with even darker brown just to get in the darkest shadows. And when you're painting hair, it's always important to go in lines that are flowing with the direction the hair is going in, and it's very important to preserve the highlights and not paint over them with a darker colour than the highlights actually are. I'm also finishing off this hair study by adding some wispy bits that are going around the lock of hair, and flyaway hairs are also what adds a lot of realism to the hair painting. Now that is the final study, so let's move on to our 11 painting and let's start to paint in her hair. Now her hair is white, so I'm going to be using a lot of gouache to create the really highlighted details, but I am still going to be doing the first base layers in the same way as I did with that brown lock of hair. So you can see that I'm starting off with a very light tone, and I'm using a mixture of purples and Payne's grey, and I created that base tone, and now I waited for that to dry, and I'm going in with the second layer where I'm building up the details. And nothing is going to bleed out because everything is dry in the layer before, so you will be able to get really nice defined details for the hair. It's very important that you don't just try and painting loads of random individual lines for the hair, otherwise it's going to look flat and it's not going to have much volume to it. It's important to work on the hair in terms of sections and try to build up those different forms and the different clumps and make them look 3D rather than just painting in loads of lines. And to do that, make sure that you're following the direction and the curvature that each section of hair is going in. For the next layer, we are going to be building up the highlights within the hair using white gouache. But before we move on to that step, if you do want to see the full real-time tutorial for this portrait, then it is available on my Patreon, as well as over 300 other real-time tutorials, all with voiceover. For each tutorial, I offer the reference image, the sketch outline, and a full materials list so that you can follow along with me in real time, and you get to build up the confidence with all of the techniques that I go through in these YouTube videos. When you sign up, you'll get instant access to hundreds of real-time tutorials that I've uploaded, as well as access to the 4 new tutorial series that I upload every single month. So if you are interested in improving your drawing and painting skills, then I'll leave a link in the description so that you can check out my Patreon and see exactly what it has to offer. Now we need to move on to adding highlights throughout our painting. And this was a question that I got asked a lot by you guys, is how do I actually create the highlights in my paintings? And gouache is one of the main ways I do that. So I use this for the hair as well as adding highlights to the face. And I'm using the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache in the shade Permanent White. Now what's great about gouache is that it can be really opaque, and so if by accident you forget to preserve a highlight, you can use the gouache to actually brighten it back up. The more water you actually add to the gouache, the more transparent it is going to be. So you can definitely get some really subtle highlights using gouache just by adding a bit more water. So the first swatch that I'm doing now is going to be where I mixed in a little bit of water with my gouache. And now with this second swatch, it is very opaque. I'm just taking the pure gouache, and you'll see that when it dries, this one is going to be a lot brighter than the first swatch where we mixed in a bit of water. Even if you mix in water into your gouache, when you apply it down onto the painting, it is going to look very bright. But the way gouache works is as it dries, it will start to look more transparent and it will start to look darker. So don't worry if you've added a lot of water but it looks really bright when you put it down, because it will definitely not be that bright and that opaque when it dries. This last swatch that I'm doing has got a lot more water mixed in, and you'll see in the final swatch how much darker it looks once it's dried. It's just a very subtle highlight. Now again, you don't want any harsh edges when you apply your highlights, so I then like to take a clean wet brush and I just like to tease out the edges when I add in gouache, especially on the face, just to give a nice smooth result. And here you can see that where we've added water, it's a lot less opaque and it's just a very subtle highlight. So I'm going to add a few highlights to that little hair study that I did. And I wouldn't normally do this with brown hair, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how I would add it. Now with something like this, I wouldn't want the gouache to be really opaque, so I would mix in a bit of water, and it's great for adding little flyaway bits of hair to your hair. So now let's go ahead and add this to our 11 painting, where we are going to be using a lot of this gouache because her hair is white. And now this was great because I didn't have to mask off the whole of the hair, which you can also do. I didn't have to do that because this is so opaque, so it will just cover up any of the watercolour. So I added lots of little bits of hair going over into the background, and I wanted to break up that really harsh line that you can see around the hair from where the watercolour ends on the hair and it starts to then become the background. So I wanted to soften out that line by adding lots of wispy bits of hair over into the background. I also wanted the hair to have a very windswept look, so you can see that I'm actually adding bits of hair that are sweeping onto the face as well. And I'm keeping it all very loose. I'm following the general direction the hair is going in, but I'm also painting some little bits of hair that are going against the direction the hair is going in to give that more windswept and natural look. And you can see that I'm adding a lot of hair around onto the background to help break it up and to make the hair look less uniformed and more natural. Finally, I'm going to start to add some highlights to the face. So I'm adding a bit of highlight to the tip and the middle of the nose, and I'll also be adding some highlights to the cheeks as well. And I make sure to place down the gouache and then to blend it out to avoid harsh lines by using a clean damp brush. And that's how I just blend out the edges so it looks nice and smooth. Remember, it will look more opaque and bright when it's wet, but it will dry a lot more translucent. But that is it for today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it and learnt some new tips for how to paint a portrait with watercolours. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.